If you haven't heard yet, I just launched Future of Work Leaders, a global community of the world's top people leaders shaping the future of work and employee experience. If you are interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. Again, that is futureofworkleaders.com. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today, Dr. David Miller. He is an ethicist, probably the first one I have ever had on this show. He's also the executive director of the Princeton Faith Work Initiative and faculty professor at Princeton. And yes, you heard that correctly, faith and work. So we're going to have a lot of really interesting things to talk about. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, Jacob. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. I know you need to make a disclaimer statement. So why don't you make that disclaimer that you're independent, and we'll jump in from there.
Sure. So this white paper that we'll be talking about, and wherever else the conversation goes, was commissioned by PMI, Philip Morris International, for my colleague Michael Tate and me to write. Michael Tate and I are the co-authors of this. But I want to stress that the views represented in it are our own. They're not Princeton University's. They're not Princeton, not PMI's. And I'm big on transparency and candor. So I just wanted to say that up front.
Very cool. And PMI actually interviewed their CEO several years ago for a book that I was working on called The Future Leader. So when I saw that you worked with PMI, and actually just talked to their chief human resource officer for another book that I'm working on. So we have a little bit of a connection there. Well, I have to ask, this combination of faith and work, you were the first ethicist I've ever talked to on this show.
Can you say that 3 times fast?
Yeah. You're also the first person I've ever talked to who has this background in faith and work. And I understand you actually went to divinity school, you studied this stuff. So give us a little bit of your background and
Sure.
How does this combination of faith and work come together? Because a lot of people might be sitting there thinking, what's the relationship?
No, fair enough. Well, first of all, Jacob, if you had told me X years ago that I'd be doing what I'm doing now, and that I'd be founding and running something called the Faith and Work Initiative, I would tell you you're smoking something illegal. Although I guess it's all legal now, but no. So at heart, I'm a corporate guy. I'm a business guy. After college, I worked for IBM for 8 years in the Northeast, and what used to be called their mainframe large systems division, and loved it. Going through the management ranks at IBM. Then I had an opportunity to go work for a former boss to work for State Street Bank and Trust, running the European operation. So my wife and I moved to London, and I moved into the finance sector, and was then working for HSBC, running their large security services division. In the last couple of years in London, I was a partner in a small, essentially private equity merchant banking firm, handling transactions in German-speaking countries. So I'm a corporate guy at heart, and that's my passion. What surprised me, and what always attracted me to the companies I had the privilege to work for, or clients, institutional clients I had, was those that really cared about values, those that were driven by ethics and doing things the right way, even if it frankly cost you the deal or cost you the transaction. This just got me thinking more and more, and I discerned what out of my tradition I call a calling, to go study theology. I didn't want to do it. I loved it. My wife and I were, life in the fast lane and all that good stuff. But there was just sort of this nagging tug or pull that I was meant to be doing something else. And after finally discerning that, okay, to do that, went to Princeton Theological Seminary first for a master's degree, and then I thought I would go back into business and just with these new ideas about values and sources of values. And I don't care what your faith tradition is, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, like whatever, but many people in the world's population will get the foundations of their values from their faith tradition. Not exclusively, but it's part of who they are. So but then I got bit by the world of ideas, reading books by brilliant people from centuries ago, and I stayed on to get a PhD in ethics, and that sort of led to this idea of joining or conjoining, merging my two worlds of being a senior executive and the cut and thrust of competition and all the creativity and challenges and joy and opportunity goes with that, with think about how can faith serve as a resource. So essentially values-based leadership is another way to say what I think about, talk, and consult with and teach on.
When did you go back to study theology? Was this like decades ago, or like what year was this?
Yeah, it was wild. I was I was about 38 years old. So
Okay.
I was in the marketplace for 16 years and thought I would never leave it because I love it. And I think in a way that's the joy of what I get to do now of working with clients like PMI and others who are really interested in making a substantial move in a different direction and to try to help them do it because I understand their world. I've sat in their chairs. I've sat in their seats, and I'm not naive or just a theorist in the ivory tower who doesn't with all due respect to some colleagues who don't understand how the rest of the world works.
So what's the connection there between faith and work? So you mentioned, like, it seems like there's a lot that you can learn from religion as far as ethics and values and morals that you can bring into business. But is that sort of the main connection there between faith and work? Is how do you bring those things into the workplace?
Yeah, I would say it's one of four ways, and that's the way I tend to accented. So I'm not really interested in using sort of academic jargon, orthodoxy, like who believes what. I mean, that's not unimportant. I'm more interested. So orthodoxy sort of means right belief, the Greek roots. I'm more interested in orthopraxy. So in practice, what does it look like? So let's say you're a Sabbath observant Jew, or you're a practicing Catholic or Muslim. So what? Like, what does that look like at work? Are you any different as a result of that? And I'm not talking about the externalities, but your character and so forth. So the connection for many people and what I tend to focus on is ethics and professional responsibility, because most of these great traditions have profound teachings on ethics. How do you, if you've harmed your neighbor, if you've shafted someone in a business transaction, how do you make reparations? How do you make them whole? But these traditions also talk about a spiritual dimension of sort of calling, meaning, purpose. And boy, today, like all my students, it's meaning and purpose. Of course, they want to make a good paycheck, but they want to find that they're doing something good for the world. And so meaning and purpose is another way faith connects with work.
It's one of the things that really struck me is, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, and I'm not sure if you've seen any recent stats or numbers, but I think Pew did a study, and this is what actually I was looking up as you were speaking, that religion across the board in the not just in the United States, but globally, has been going down considerably. In other words, with each passing year, fewer people subscribe to any kind of a religion, whether it's Christianity or Judaism. And I also wonder, is there a correlation in that with, at the same time, the decrease in trust in government, with trust in business, with trust in leaders, with decline in employee engagement and satisfaction? Because there used to be a time when a lot of people did believe in some religion, whatever it was, and you would go to church on Sunday or synagogue, and you had those values that were so important. And now more and more people don't believe in anything, right? We're losing people out of all religions. And that to me seems a little bit of a problem too, because to your point, religion is where you go to learn about morals and ethics and values and all these different things that are so important to you, regardless of what religion you're in. So have you been paying attention to that as well? Is that a concern for you at all?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. So first, I'd push back a little bit on the statistics that, to be sure, in the West, they're and increasingly in the U.S., sort of catching up with Europe. There's a less religiosity if we measure it by congregational attendance on one Sabbath. That's for sure a trend that's going on. But there's other data put up by Pew and other researchers that also will point out that the percentage of people that believe in God or some higher power and believe in prayer, even believe in an afterlife, is still very high, and that's not changed that much. So that number you'll find more in the high 80 type percent based on which survey you look at, and that's globally. So I think with that, my interpretation is that people are fed up with institutions that they don't trust anymore because they've been let down by them, whether they're the government, an NGO, the United Nations, the Catholic Church, fill in the blank. so I think there's a pushback on the institutional dimension, but there still is a human hunger to figure out, why am I here? What's my purpose in life? Is there something bigger than me just going on?
Yeah.
So that's curious pushback and yet attraction. And I think the religious traditions have to rethink how they tell their story, and also how they behave.
Yeah, and I pulled up that stat. I think it was from 2021, and it said 80% of U.S. adults believe in a higher power or spiritual force, and only 56% of those believe in God as described in the Bible, and 33% believe in some sort of a higher force, and 10% do not believe in anything. So yeah, it's interesting that there's still some sort of like belief in a higher power or spiritual force, but a decline in religion. But to me, if you believe in some sort of a spiritual force, it doesn't necessarily, you still are missing a lot of the perhaps values and morals and ethics that you might get from a more structured religion where you have community, you go to a temple or synagogue or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Which I think is so important. I think there was a study that was done, I think it was in Australia, I can't remember, where it was a bunch of surgeons, I think it was in a hospital or something. And they were getting a lot of complaints, like the staff who were working in the operating room were getting a lot of complaints about just inappropriate behavior and just how people were talking in the operating room. And what they did is, to solve that problem, they just put up a picture of an eye. So in the operating room, they just put up a picture of an eye to see if that would change anything. And just because they put up a picture of the eye in the operating room, the behavior totally changed. And to me, that was a really interesting experiment, because it showed that when people believe that they are being watched by some sort of by some sort of an observer, their behavior changes. And that to me is also really interesting. And so, I didn't grow up super religious. I mean, I'm somewhat religious. I'm Jewish. But I get a lot, and I have a community of friends that I live around here in Los Angeles who are also Jewish. And, we get a lot of value out of the morals, the community, the values. It comes up in conversation. I think it makes a big difference. And it also makes its way into work, too.
Absolutely. And I think for folks who are part of a religious community, again, regardless of what stripe or flavor, and let's say they have somewhat regular attendance 1 or 2 times a month, maybe a little bit more, whatever, they at least have a few hours during the whole month where they're thinking about something bigger than themselves. Because inevitably these traditions point heavenwards, for lack of a better phrase, and you're thinking about the greater good, the common good. And so much of today, maybe it's always been this way, but my sense is it's on steroids now, is that it's about me, myself, and I. And how do I maximize my potential?
Yeah.
How do I make sure I am satisfied, that I have meaning and purpose? And many of the traditions, certainly, what you just mentioned, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, gosh, a lot of it's about self-sacrifice. Taking care of the other, doing unpleasant things, but you have to do the right thing for society. And whether it's any of the great biblical figures you could think of, there's a call on you. I ran a nonprofit for a while called, and now I use it as my consulting arm, but it was called the Avodah Institute. And you might remember, if you were bar mitzvah, that the word Avodah, A-V-O-D-A-H, it means 3 different things in the Hebrew text, and even in modern Hebrew today. Sometimes the word avodah, or the root of it, could be translated as work, like working in a field or working in a factory or working on a podcast. Other times, avodah can be translated as in worship. As for me and my house, we will avodah the Lord. We will worship the Lord. So it has this sense of worship. And the third way is service. And you might know there's like the Jewish avodah service corps. So in this one rich word, there's these sort of a vertical dimension of honoring God, serving neighbor, and that your work is the vehicle to often do those 2 things together. So I think religion can give frameworks and encouragement, because a lot of times also in the marketplace, it's tough. You get beaten up, someone takes credit for your work, you get laid off for no fault of your own, and religion can also give people, or religious practices can also give people a sort of a balm in Gilead, to use an old phrase, some succor and whatnot.
Yeah.
So if you take all this away, the kind of the formal instruction to your kind of your earlier question, and more people aren't part of a community where, even if nothing else as a teenager, they get exposed to these things and these teachings. To me, it kind of begs the question, well, where will your ethics come from
Yeah.
when the rubber hits the road? And if your children are raised kind of like you are in that sense, well, where are they going to sort of play the generational thing? What would be the source of, other than just human created values, that at some point there's I think an important role for metaphysical values.
Yeah, and also to the point of purpose and meaning. And I'm not saying that, religion and a lot of people think of religion as just religion, but religion is also where a lot of people get community from. A lot of
Yeah,
people get the
absolutely.
purpose, the meaning, the faith. Like we're not just talking about showing up to a temple or a synagogue or a church or whatever it is and saying a couple prayers and going home, but it's where you
Yeah.
meet people. It's where you get community. And so sometimes I wonder, and I've heard a lot of pundits talk about this as well, that when you remove any of these kinds of institutions from communities, it becomes very challenging for people to figure out, where do you get purpose and meaning from?
Yeah.
Where do you get community from? And then we see arguments of people turning to a lot of, the whole argument for wokeism. That's been a really big argument as well, because people are losing religion and communities and faith. They're turning to things like wokeism. I've heard the argument that they're making these changes towards climate, towards all sorts of, like, they're just looking for purpose and meaning in different areas. And they're just going to wherever they're going to be accepted and acknowledged. Would you say that's a fair argument to make?
The argument being that
That if you don't,
we're replacing, we're finding substitutes.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, and I think a lot of those substitutes end up either being self-serving or hollow,
yeah,
and not robust and rich and challenging. And there's another part that religious communities, again, at their best, offer is help when you're down and out. So, for instance, my wife has multiple sclerosis; she has MS, and so our life's just a little more complicated than some people's. And the kind of the old, what some people used to joke and call casserole ministry, where the ladies of the church would come by and drop food off or whatever. And of course, now it could be men too, but that the church sort of has this. They take care of their neighbor and their own as well, or the synagogue. And I don't know if I go to a climate change meeting, if someone's going to say, "Hey, can I bring you a casserole?" Since
So I'm really curious, what do you teach your students? Because I find the intersection of faith and work very interesting. But I'm trying to, for a lot of people who are listening or watching, they are either leaders in organizations or they're aspiring leaders. And obviously, they're not going to show up to work one day and start, trying to convert their team members or their company to some sort of a religious, whatever denomination.
Nor would I recommend that.
Yeah, exactly. So what is it exactly that you are teaching your students? Because a lot of them are going into the workplace. What are some of the concepts or ideas or the topics that are relevant for them in the business world?
Yeah. So one of the biggest sort of pedagogical challenges I have is the students. The name of the course is Professional Responsibility and Ethics, and the students, these are undergraduate students. I teach just juniors and seniors who have had a bit more work experience over the summer, by that point, internships and whatnot. And they've nicknamed the course "Succeeding Without Selling Your Soul."
Interesting.
So I've now called the course "Succeeding Without Selling Your Soul." And why? The most ethicists, the way they teach ethics, it's either from a jurisprudence point of view, and a lawyer teaches it, sort of somewhat equating law and ethics, which is important to have the law perspective, but I think insufficient. The other mode is through secular Greco-Roman philosophy, which is also really, really important. What did Plato say, and what did all those great old folks in the Stoics say? Really important. But what's happened over the past few decades is a lot of higher education has stepped away from what role the religious traditions have in shaping values, shaping and forming values. I mean, I would put Maimonides and St. Thomas Aquinas up the smartest philosophers of the day, secular philosophers.
Yeah.
So I give permission for that to be an intellectual part of the course. And I make it very clear day one, it's not about who's right or wrong on the ultimate questions of life. It's what does your tradition teach? And if you don't have a tradition, let's say someone's in fact, I do anonymous polling in the class. I know that every year somewhere between 23 and 25% of my students self-describe as atheists or agnostics. Yet they're taking the course. They've signed up because they don't have a lot of electives, and they're taking it because it goes back to this yearning. And they'll often say to me afterwards, "Hey, can I talk to you, Prof? Like, I just haven't thought about this, or I've never thought about it in such an open-minded way." And I encourage them. I say, somewhere in your tradition, your grandma was something, and kind of claim that as your heritage, and try to learn a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
So what I do though, so that's sort of the design. It's different that I give intellectual permission to intellectually think about these extraordinary traditions. And the second thing I do is that I bring in C-suite CEOs from a variety of different companies to come in and talk about their story and how, unlike Gordon Gekko, greed is not good. And you don't have to step over everybody to get to the top. The road may be a little bit slower, but they can suddenly have positive role models, and not just like from the TV shows Billionaire and all those other great shows.
Yeah.
And they can also help make the connections as to how and it's all very private, that's off the record kind of when they're talking, but how at some point they'll tell a story or two of how their faith tradition got them through a tough situation or helped them make the noble decision as opposed to the easy decision.
Are there degrees of ethics? Because, for me, it's hard to say, for example, you're ethical or you're not. Right. For example, let's say you go to a supermarket, you check out, you get home and you realize, you look at the receipt that the grocery store didn't charge you for like a gallon of milk. Do you need to drive back 20 minutes and say, hey, you didn't charge me for that gallon of milk? Are you not an ethical person if you don't do that? Versus I'm at work, there's a job that's available and it's me and my friend, and I'm going to stab my friend in the back and start rumors about them so that they don't get the promotion and I do. You could kind of make the argument that if you don't return the milk, you're not ethical. And if you stab your friend in the back, you're not ethical. But there are degrees to this, right? So how do you think about ethics at work? Because to me, it seems like it's impossible to just always be 100% ethical, right?
Yeah, or just in life, but certainly at work. To be sure that I would argue and that there is sort of a hierarchy of sins, if you want to put it there, or a hierarchy of ethical lapses. And of the I'll just call them the great traditions, probably Catholicism has spent the most intellectual time thinking about that. And they do have a range of sins from venial to mortal and various subcodifications. And in Judaism, kind of its 613 laws, like which ones apply to which cases. So I think there's an intellectual and practical recognition that stealing a loaf of bread just because you're a schmuck versus stealing a loaf of bread because your kids are starving, those are two different things. And how do you respond to them, even though the act is the same, stealing, but both are theft, but one might be more forgivable and one not. And different traditions have sort of practices for how do you make yourself whole if you've harmed your neighbor, if you've screwed up. In fact, my colleague Michael Tate, also commissioned by PMI, there's a copy here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's called "Towards a Restoration of Trust." Towards a Restoration of Trust, and we looked at insights and lessons from wisdom traditions, which is another way of the way we look at these faith traditions, and found that there's a lot of wisdom in how an organization, if they've harmed their clients, if they've harmed society with their products and goods and services over the years, how do you pivot? Which gets us a little bit into the white paper, but also can you find wisdom from these old traditions, and without being religiosity focused but wisdom focused, what can you learn from these? And they all have pathways back to healing. Yom Kippur, or the rite of confession, there's a pathway to pause and hit the reset button, and that gives people a lot of hope. And my students I think they're really intrigued by that, and they've just never heard of it thought this way. So But I built the course around five questions called the 5 Qs of ethics, 5 essential questions.
Yeah,
And in
maybe we
fact,
can go through those. I think that'd be super helpful.
sure, real quick. So, question one is sort of the duh question. That's what is ethics? And kind of do a little brainstorm. What is ethics? And of course, there's academic definitions and other ones like doing the right thing, what you ought to do, the normative thing, or when nobody's looking. So, question one is what's ethics? But it's not just the thought part; it's action. So you can come up with the right theory, but do you have action? So it's theory and action put together. And I have a one-sentence definition that I use. Ira Milstein used to have it on his desk. He was, as you may know, just passed recently. He was sort of the godfather of the modern corporate governance movement, and he framed a copy of it on his desk. So to me, ethics is the right, the good. It's discerning, having the sort of, it's pausing and to discern the right, the good, and the fitting action, and having the creativity and courage to take it. And there's a lot packed in that, which we won't go into now. But essentially, what's ethics? Because ethics is not one monolithic discipline. Broadly speaking, there's 3 different fields or strands of thought, kind of a rules-based thought.
Okay.
There's kind of outcomes, utilitarian-based cost. And then the third strand would be sort of virtue ethics, where it's more of your character. You don't need laws or sort of a calculus to determine it. So what is question? What is ethics? Question 2, Q2, is what's the source of your ethics? What's your coach, your rabbi, your boss, the government, your grandma? Well, it's probably a lot of those things.
Yeah.
But then you ask, well, where did they get it from, or where did they get it from? Sooner or later, you bump into metaphysical questions. So I just want them to think about that. And I'm not trying to lead the witness, but it's a big question. Many will say they've just never thought of it. It's a vexing question and an important one, because if our values are important, where we get them kind of matters as a corollary.
Yeah, there was. I was just reading I can't remember the book it was, but it was an author that was trying to make the argument that a lot of us are born with our sense of knowing what is right and what is wrong. And they used this. There was an experiment that was done where I guess babies, newborns, they were looking at blocks that were bumping into each other. And then they looked at blocks that were bumping into each other, but they put facial features on these blocks. And when certain blocks were bumping into different blocks and being aggressive with them and clearly pushing them out of the way, the babies were staring very intently at these bully blocks. And the author has made the argument that even at a young age, children are born innately with this understanding of what is right and what is wrong. And that because they knew these bully blocks were being bad, they were, giving them the death stare, which I thought was very, very interesting. And yeah, it certainly makes you think. And I think was it C.S. Lewis? He had a quote where he talked about this idea of a string. And I don't know exactly what the quote was, but he said something along the lines of, you don't know, you only know what a curved string is because you innately know what a straight one is, or something along those lines. It was an interesting quote. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's very interesting to ask that question on where these things come from.
Yeah, and it's great. I think you're right. It's great self-reflection, and many of the traditions will talk about sort of that God has planted a seed or created the image of God, which should suggest that there's some echo, some reflection. Not perfect, we're not God, but that there's sort of biologically engineered into our DNA that there's something there.
And the quote is, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. And so the argument that he was making is that for you to have an idea of a straight line innately came from somewhere. Somebody, a higher power gave you this idea of what a straight line is. So it's all really interesting stuff. No, whether you believe in religion or faith or not, it's just the concepts are interesting, I think.
Absolutely. But hey, wrap it up real quick. The other question 3 is what's your ethical decision-making framework? So when you're in the ethical gray zone, no matter how smart you are, how much experience, you just don't quite know what to do. You feel damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I have the students develop their own ethical decision-making framework, which helps offset some of our the way our brain neurologically will trick us sometimes. It's very multidisciplinary, this course, and a lot of research tells us how we see what we want to see and don't see other things and so forth. And it also helps move away from our biases. Just like in Myers-Briggs, there's people who are like introverts and extroverts and things like that, personality typing. I believe that we're sort of pre-wired. I can't fully prove it, but my research suggests that we're pre-wired to think along one of these three different intellectual strands I've talked about. I call them the right, the good, and the fitting. And so, if you're not thinking about the other two, you're making an impoverished ethical choice. So that's Q3. Q4 is maybe today in the political polarized world we're in, it's a very important one. That's what's your public language? So how do you express your ethical views when you're at a board meeting? How do you do it when you're in a country or culture where you don't speak if you're a woman, or you're junior in the totem pole? Let's say in Japan, you're not really encouraged to speak it. The junior person just does not do that. Well, how do you speak truth to power? How do you make your point? Particularly if it's driven by your morals from your faith tradition, well, maybe that you're in a country that doesn't think that way. So what's your public language? Has a lot loaded into that. And the fifth and final question is how do you stay ethically fresh? How do you stay ethically fresh? I have two very close friends who've gone to jail for white collar crime.
Wow.
One was involved in Rick Singer's Varsity Blues admissions scandal a few years ago, and he is just the best guy in the world, a straight arrow, a black and white kind of guy, and yet even he got caught up in this. So how do you stay ethically fresh? And so we talk about that. So anyway, I've just turned the book into or the course into a book, and it's under contract with Princeton University Press. So this time next year, with a bit of luck, it'll be out.
What do Tractor Supply, Neiman Marcus, Johnson & Johnson, Dow, Lego, Northrop Grumman, and dozens of other companies all have in common? They are all a part of the Future of Work Leaders community. This is a global community of the world's top people leaders shaping the future of work and employee experience. If you're interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. I'm also really curious, you mentioned the name of the course, right? Is something along how to be ethical without selling your soul or something along those lines?
Yeah, succeeding without selling your soul, yeah.
Succeeding without selling your soul. How do you, because this happens probably on a daily basis to a lot of people who are in the corporate world, right? You're trying to be ethical, you're trying to do the right thing, and inevitably you're confronted with a situation where you have to bend, right? Maybe there is somebody at work who's trying to come after you. Maybe you have a boss who's rude, or maybe, I don't know, you just have a huge promotion opportunity. How do you, is there a framework or a way that people can think about their ethics versus how do you stay true to it? Is it okay to bend sometimes? Should you never bend? Because that to me is a challenge, right? It seems like you can't be perfect all the time. So you need to have some sort of an algorithm on, what are your non-negotiables, I guess? I don't know. How do you think about that? Because we're all faced with that.
Yeah, we talk about that in the course, and one of the things that I advise the students is I'm told I have a bad habit of saying, if you remember nothing else from this course, remember this, and of course I like say that every class 10 times, so that there's a long list of these things. But one of them is sort of my aphorisms is that picking your fights. You have to discern. Picking your fights is you cannot live an ethically pure life. No one can. I can't. And so what are, as you say, non-negotiables? Someone tells a racist or an LGBTQ joke or something like that, and everyone's at a bar after work having drinks, and well, do you laugh, or do you look at your feet with embarrassment, or do you call the guy out, assuming it's a guy, in front of everyone and say, hey, that's not cool, don't do that, that's not right, or do you wait till afterwards, or do you just say nothing and go on? What if it's your boss who tells the racist joke? In general, I encourage students to, it's back to your public language too. How do you stand up and stand tall? But there are times when you have to bite your tongue and save your firepower for, save your troops for another day. Save your fighting for a different issue.
And I guess the context matters too. This actually came up fairly recently during the elections, right? Where there was a comedian at the Madison Square
Right.
Garden rally, Tony Hinchcliffe, and he's known as being a roast comedian. Like that's what he does. He roasts people. He's an insult comic, and he made that comment about Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage. And it was really interesting because you saw people come out on both sides. Some people were like, yeah, it was just a joke, but it was tasteless. And then people on the other side were like, oh my God, that's the end of the world. He's so racist and this and that. So, the context also really matters, I think, in which things get told. So do you teach your students, for example, do you just make a list of what your non-negotiables are? Or how do you, or is it just not possible to do that, to give yourself kind of a framework of, I don't know.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that they're not experienced enough in the world to even imagine the kind of things they're going to bump into.
Yeah.
As starting to say, although one of the biggest pedagogical challenge I have is teaching these really good kids. Like none of them are schmucks. Like they're ones they wouldn't be taking a course if they weren't sort of oriented towards wanting to live a good life and an ethical life.
Yeah.
So one of the big challenges is to get them to know you too are going to someday do unethical things. Sorry, statistically you will. So I have an exercise I take them through which helps them think about that and then hopefully come out on the other side with what you're saying to begin for them to think about, well, I will never do A, B, and C. Now, the reality is they still may do those because the world is difficult and our best, people say marriage vows and then they have an affair, right? Like, well, what happened? So they did something they swore they would never do. So I get them thinking about that at a young age, which hopefully is a gift to them because I know I didn't think about these sort of questions till I was a little bit older.
Yeah. What if you're not older? What if you are a mid or senior level leader inside of an organization? Is it different for you than as opposed to if you're just entering the workplace?
Yeah, I think there's different times of the career when someone feels powerless, that you don't have a sphere of influence. And I would actually argue the opposite. I think whether you're the data entry clerk or the receptionist, or whether you're a mid-level manager where you may feel lost in the bureaucracy or you're a true senior executive manager, I think everyone has a domain or sphere of influence. And maybe it's quote-unquote just your peer group and your colleagues, but that's still a sphere of influence. So you can make it. So I try to encourage people that all the things that I teach and think about, that in your zone, you can do it. And you might be frustrated that the world around you or the company around you is still very disappointing and you can't change that. And probably maybe you can't. There might be an exceptional time or two where you can, but so I encourage to remind them the huge value of everyone, at least making sure that where they do have an influence with their peers and their subordinates, that they can make a difference. And the other thing I try to get them to think about is that it's a long game they're playing, and you look back and you never know how you might touch or change one person's life that then changes the whole trajectory of an organization.
Why is ethics at work important? Because we all know people who have gotten ahead, who are who've maybe done shady things, and maybe they're friends, but we're like, yeah, or maybe they're very wealthy, and you're kind of like, yeah, I know you made your money in like not very ethical ways. You never gotten caught, you never gotten exposed, or you became the top executive at a company through playing office politics. And we all kind of know people like that. And sometimes we look at them and we say, well, why does ethics matter? Clearly, these people are able to do it. The hell with my ethics. I'm going to do just whatever I need to do to get ahead as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a legitimate strategy. I don't think it's a wise strategy. I don't think that's the right long-term strategy. And the different guests I have come in and talk to the students, they validate that. That there are many of the people don't get justice as we think of it during our lifetimes, that they seem to die having been able to be dishonest their whole career. But I guess we have to, if one is a person of faith, say vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and hope that there's some ultimate reckoning where the wheat is separated from the chaff. I think we even talked about that in the white paper of the sense of needing justice. That, let me see if I can find the quote. Let's
But we
see.
also know,
Yeah,
we also all know people who've gotten caught.
yeah.
So
Yeah, you can't assume that exactly that's a guaranteed way to get ahead.
yeah, there's a little bit of luck
And the
involved in
reality
life too.
the reality is there was I had a guy from one of the big executive recruiting headhunting companies come and talk to the students. And he said, you would be surprised that, he said, I am looking for truth tellers. I don't want sycophants around me. I don't want people who are just kissing my butt. I want people who will say, hey, boss, I respect your opinion. Hey, you're the boss, so whatever you say goes. But I got to tell you, I'm uncomfortable with this, or I don't think this is right, which kind of brings us back to Q4. What's your public language? And I know in my executive career, or even now as an academic, when I love it when a student challenges and takes me on. It's like, wow, maybe they're right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I think this sense of that we always have to give up if we're in the middle of a company or upper middle of a company. I think good executives are just yearning for that person who will tell the emperor that they have no clothes on.
A lot of our conversation right now has been focused, I think, a little bit more on the individual, but you also have this really cool model in the book, the TAM model, where you talk about believability, buy-in, and barometer, which is more from an organizational level for a company that's looking to drive organizational change in an ethical way. And I know we only have 15 minutes left. I thought we could expand on that model a little bit and give people who are listening and watching a little bit of a framework on how to apply that. So can you start with just an overview and a background of what that model is, what it's designed to do, and then maybe we can break down those three elements?
Sure. And briefly, the context for this was with my work with PMI and other organizations that are genuinely trying to do a transformation, as the jargon is, or to have a substantive change that it's not easy. And the executives charged with leading it will often use phrases like there's another company I worked with in the finance sector that was doing this, and they said that it's like you're trying to fly an airplane and land it on time, and at the same time redesign and rebuild the airplane all in midair. So it's a difficult thing to do to fix the guts of your business. And one of the things that dawned really clearly on Michael Tate and me, my co-author, was the importance of understanding what's your motivation for change. Is it because you've had a crisis? People say, oh, you never waste a good crisis. Well, after the cameras go away and the news cycle goes by and you say your apologies or you move on, if that's your only motivation, it's not going to change. If you're doing window dressing, it's not going to change. So you really have to, a true and sustainable and effective transformation has to go to the core of the business. And it has to decide what it's not going to do anymore, what it's going to do additionally that it didn't do in the past, and what it's going to do differently. So the motivation really matters. Is the board behind you? Is it just the CEO? Because you're going to have three kinds of people in the organization that are going to say, well, this whole new thing, some are going to be like, thank God you're finally doing this. Yes, I'm all in. And I don't know, maybe that's the quarter of the people. And then you'll have another group that's going to say, I'm going to wait and see. I just don't trust how this is going to go. I don't know. I've heard all this before. And sort of a cynical attitude. And the final group, maybe another quarter, are going to be saying, I am totally against this. I am scared to death. This does not augur well for me. The skills that made me successful for the past 20 years of my career, they're not needed anymore. And I don't have the new skills that are needed. So there's a lot of fear that goes around it. So the motivation of change, are you doing it for some noble purpose and I hope to make money, because companies need to make money. You can't just pull off the switch and stop doing something. So part of that, so let's say you embark and you say, all right, we're going to transform our company. We want to take another industry sector, take the food sector. So let's say you're PepsiCo or Coca-Cola, whatever. PepsiCo used to be a client of mine. And they're trying to move from salty snacks and sugary products to healthier products. And so they changed their product line. Did they stop selling the completely salty products? No, they still have those in their portfolio, but they're giving clients a choice. So those who want healthier things that are good for you can do. So how do you do that? That's very difficult. And how do you measure the success, which kind of gets us into what Michael and I call this transformation assessment model or framework, the TAM, that it's kind of three vectors, if you could sort of think of it that way, that go into it, and kind of sort of a three-dimensional vector. So the first one, let's say it's the vertical vector, I would call that believability. Like, is this just window dressing, slick PR, or is this genuine all the way from the top to the bottom and all around? Is it really, really real? And then the second vector, which you could think of maybe as the vertical vector, or the horizontal vector, I should say, is the buy-in. Like, is there true buy-in from the board? Is there buy-in from the marketplace? But at least, and is there shareholder buy-in? Because sometimes when a company embarks on this, the short-termism of Wall Street says, no, we don't really want you to change. We like you doing it just the way you do it, because it's very risky to make a genuinely transformative change. And the third, which maybe we can call the depth, so we've got 3D, so we've got vertical, horizontal, and the depth vector. Let's call that barometers. And the barometers are, well, how do you measure this, and how do you think about this, and really truly assess it? And all these three vectors, by the way, you could put a numeric scale next to them, ask a series of questions, which we talk about in the white paper, and you could assess. So and the barometers are hugely important. So that gets into people, what we call people, process, and scrutiny are kind of the three subsets of that. And for purpose of this call, we don't need to go into the depth of each, but there's really no framework out there now that talks about that. And most of the academic research by some great scholars, when we talk about it in the book, they largely talked about why companies internally get it wrong, but they don't tend to talk about exogenous things. So what happens in the marketplace, or COVID, or Ukraine, or Gaza, fill in the blank, that they aren't ready for things that are totally outside their control. We noticed also that so a lot of the focus is on the company trying to transform itself. But what about companies who are, let's say, social activists, who are wanting the company to change, wanting someone to stop doing something, stop selling, let's say, stop selling salty snacks completely, or the energy sector, just stop selling petroleum tomorrow, go out of, just stop. Well, a lot of those organizations are often there's ethical misconduct by the watchdog organizations as well, and the advocates. A quick story: one company I know in the food sector, sort of big food, whatever you want to call it, they very interesting invited someone, I can't remember which animal welfare advocacy group it was, but one of the animal welfare advocacy groups, saying, hey, we'd like you to come and talk to our senior executives. We want to understand more your point of view to make sure we're not missing something, because we care about animal welfare too. You may not believe us, but we do, and we're trying to always move our standards and raise what was yesterday seen as acceptable, today is seen as barbaric. So how do we move? And they said, no, we don't want to talk to you. Well, why is that? Because we want you to go out of business. Like, they don't want you to succeed.
Yeah.
So the very people that are advocating for change actually, ironically, don't want you to succeed. Yeah. And that's across industry sectors. It's sad. So this TAM, this transformation model, and the little scale you could build around it, that it could also be used to measure other organizations too, not just your own who's transforming, but the advocacy organizations. And we need advocacy organizations, of course, don't get me wrong. But sometimes there's the shadow side of how transformation goes that external people don't know about.
And I guess is the simple way to think about this. So believability, when I think of that, I think of like the story, right? The story of change, and if it is grounded in some sort of reality, or if you are painting a story that people don't believe. But at the same time, you also hear some organizations who talk about this idea of creating a vision that is unattainable, right? Like, you want the story to be unbelievable and unattainable so that people reach for it. So, for example, I don't know, wasn't Google's "Do No Harm" or something like that?
Oh yeah, the original.
Yeah, like they put something out there where it's not possible.
Oh no, don't be evil. That was it. Don't be evil.
Don't be evil. Yeah. So how do you tie in the story to be grounded in reality, but at the same time having it be inspirational enough where it's out of reach that you're going to keep going for it? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you might remember the couple of the great early explorers, Cortez and others. There's this burn the ships
Yes.
thing we talked about in the paper. So there's no plan B. You got it. You got to go conquer or win or whatever your goal is. And that's a bit of a violent metaphor that Michael and I weren't so keen on. But we talked about, can you repurpose your ship? So you still got you're not burning the ship, but you're repurposing it to go towards a nobler purpose in society. And the believability, I kind of boils down to two things, and they're related: transparency and candor. So transparency first acknowledges your history. Hey, we did a lot of things that we're not proud of now, and we have paid our amends to society and so forth. And in fact, we even want to include people we've harmed in the past to help us think about our future and what we could do differently. So they repurpose but you do that through candor. You have to be willing to open the kimono, as the saying goes. Let someone come in and look at your research, come in and ask your scientists hard questions, and then be candid. And likewise, if you're wide of the mark and the progress isn't going where you want it to go, you need to tell both your employees as well as the market, hey, we're behind schedule. We had hoped to have X% of our revenues coming from this less harmful product now, and we're not there. Or in this area we're falling short, or in this area we've learned something. Because these transformations, they're multi-year things. It's not like a 2-quarter deal. And someone asked me, well, how long? And I said, well, going back to C.S. Lewis, how long is a piece of string? But you got to. It's a 7-year process. You need to be willing to have substantial capital to go into it and make tough people decisions because you need new talent to bring in and so forth. But all this again can be measured and give qualitative and quantitative tool to be transparent and share what's going on. So that's part of the believability and buy-in.
Okay, and so so I guess that's the buy-in piece is more, do you get people to buy in by choice, not out of like fear, right? So buy-in to me means you don't do it because, well, if you don't, you're going to get fired. You do it because, hey, I want to go in the direction that, the vision that you've created because I genuinely believe in it. Because you could create buy-in in a lot of different ways, right? You could create it by force, like move in this direction or you're going to be fired. Or you could create buy-in with, hey, here's this really cool, compelling thing that we're doing. It's amazing. Do you want to move in that direction? Somebody like an Elon Musk, hate him or love him, the guy's trying to put people on Mars. A couple of weeks ago, he caught a rocket in midair with 2 giant chopsticks. So, the guy is creating buy-in for the vision that he's trying to create. Yeah. So I'm assuming how you create the buy-in matters.
Yeah, absolutely right. And also, what's the can't remember the acronym right now, but sort of the big goal, the unattainable goal that you need. Let's go to the moon and so forth. So companies like the ones who sponsored this paper, that they talk about wanting to be a smoke-free future. Yeah. Like wait, what? Like the cynic is going to say, well, that's
where tobacco company.
Yeah. So if you're going to claim that you're generally doing it, well, you better be prepared, going back to this vector, to these 3 vectors in the TAM, to back it up that you're doing it and to show it. And that's how you can get people to buy in. But statistically, there's going to be always a percentage of your employees who, no matter how compelling, how exciting the new vision is, they're just going to say, for any number, I'm scared spitless, I'm not good enough, there's reasons they're going to back away from it. And then companies probably will have to think, how do I compassionately and appropriate release those people? Because you can't have people rowing in the wrong direction. At a certain point, you have to make those hard decisions.
And then it seems like barometer is the easiest one, right? That's identify the metrics that you need to make sure that you are moving in the right direction. And so I guess depending on what the transformation is, the metrics might be different. But what is it, Lord Kelvin, who said, you can't measure, you can't improve what you don't measure, something along those lines.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any metrics,
what you don't measure. Exactly. And by the way, and organizations that I've shared this with, other ones, because the sponsor PMI did this, not just for their own purpose, but for thought leadership for a wider market. Many people are looking and saying, "Wow, this is how do we do this?" And it's exciting to see that this take place in the wider industry, not just their sector. That these are things that, and also I mean, universities should look at this as well, or other institutions that have been around for a while too, that they need to think of how do we transform, and what's the motivation for transforming, and how do we measure it, so we're not just relying on bringing in one of the big consultancy firms who drive the whole ship for you. Like, how do you make sure you're owning it and measuring it?
Well, last question for you before we wrap up. Where do people start? So obviously you have this white paper on the ethics of organizational change. People can grab that white paper too. I think if you just Google ethics of organizational change, David Miller, it's pretty easy to find. We'll try to link to it in the show notes. But let's say people, didn't read the white paper and they're listening to this and they're thinking, okay, give me a starting point. Where do I begin?
Yeah, so I would say first starting point is it's old-fashioned thing. I do a little reading and read the white paper. Take an hour and pour yourself a nice cup of coffee and read it quietly, because it has, I think, a great flow, a sense of historical perspective. It moves past a lot of the polarity and platitudes that you'll find in a lot of things. There's depth to it. There's logic, and it all comes together. So the first thing is read, and then the second thing is, where are you in your organization? And by the way, you're right. I think the link has been given to how to get this, or you can also Google my name, and we have a copy of it on our Faith and Work Initiative website as well. But to say, all right, well, how do I bring this into my company? Who is the right person to help us think about this? How do we, first of all, are we trying to do a transformation? Should we be doing a transformation? Because sometimes the smart thing to do is not to chase the latest fad. And as we keep sticking with this ship metaphor, moor your ship in a safe harbor and just wait till the storm goes by, and then come afterwards. But starting point is, particularly if you're a C-suite level person, to say this is at least worth a hearing. I mean, heck, give me a call. I'll talk to you. And as I work with a lot of, in fact, as a quick aside, in the consultancy part of my work, it's largely with companies that are in what I would call challenging industries. So I work with fossil fuel companies who are trying to transform their model. I work with in the financial sector who, over the years, have many reasons to have been beaten up for different things, and they are trying to transform. In fact, one of my clients used the whole 5 Qs we were talking about in the classroom for their company standard on how do you make decisions in an ethical gray zone. Wow. So I'm really interested in companies that are mature enough to know that they need to change, and they need to change at the core, not just put a new coat of paint on. And if you're that kind of person, I think those are the kind of folks I enjoy advising.
Love it. Well, where can people go to learn more about you? Anything that you want to mention for people to check out?
Gosh, yeah, just to our website, faithandwork.princeton.edu. That's one thing. Or Google my name, David W. Miller, and say Faith and Work, and that'll take you to our website. And I'll do my best to respond as I can. But you'll find a lot of resources there on the topics we were talking about in the first half of our call about faith and work as such, as a bucket, as a category, and this white paper, which it's passing the sniff test. I've shared it with a lot of friends I have in very responsible positions, and they're the kind of people that are candid. They'll say, Miller, you're blowing smoke on this one, or hey, you're onto something, and they're all saying you're onto something. So Michael and I are pretty pleased.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for tuning in, for watching, for listening. My guest again, Dr. David Miller, pretty easy to find, and I'll see all of you next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. If you want to get access to more content on how you can become future ready, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. It's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.